Good morning and welcome. I'm Dean Miller, the President and CEO of PACT, and I want to welcome you to our continuing part 2 of our MedTech series on primary initial challenges of a MedTech startup. We have a terrific panel today, and before we jump into that, I want to first of all thank all of our sponsors. We could not do all of our programming, certainly without great sponsors, and particularly on the MedTech series. I want to thank Baker Tilly, Drexel University, Duane Morris, Fox Rothschild, and EisnerAmper. We are in a webcast, obviously, so attendees, please stay muted. You can ask your questions a couple of ways. You can certainly raise your hand, but the best way to do it is to ask questions in the chat box, which we'll monitor throughout. The panel will go to about 9:30 or shortly thereafter. And then after that, you'll be welcomed with with a link to our Remo virtual networking room, where you can connect with speakers as well as each other on a face-to-face platform, which you'll find really engaging. So with that, let me welcome and introduce our moderator. And we are very fortunate this morning, not just this morning, but here in Philadelphia, to have Tiffany Wilson, AKA Tiff. Tiff comes to Philadelphia now permanently from Atlanta just earlier this year to become the president and CEO of the Science Center. And what you may not know is that Tiff has a real depth of experience professionally in the medtech sector. She's bringing that to the Science Center along with a host of other skills. And we are really excited to have her here this morning to moderate our panel. Welcome, Tiff.
Thank you so much, Dean, and thank you and Heidi for inviting me to participate in this event. So as you mentioned, I'm still relatively new, coming up on a year, hard to believe, as president and CEO of the Science Center. It's wonderful to be in Philadelphia. I do bring a lot of medtech background. I love the medtech sector. I'm super excited to engage with medtech entrepreneurs in the Philadelphia region. And so today we're talking about, planning for success and navigating initial challenges of medtech startups, of which there are many. This is an industry that's not for the faint of heart. It is not rocket science, but it is complicated. And I'm really excited about our panelists today and getting to know these folks and as we navigate and build kind of a stronger medtech ecosystem in the Philadelphia region. And so we're going to talk a lot about today about knowing your customer, about reimbursement, supply chain and distribution. And in my experience, not only, in a decade in medical device startups, but then the past almost 10 years building the Global Center for Medical Innovation in Atlanta, what we find was that it's not necessarily the challenge of getting through FDA anymore. It's really the challenge of getting the economic model right and getting into the healthcare systems. And so really looking forward to the insights and lessons learned from our panel today to help shed some light on the latest and greatest on these issues. And so on that note, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce yourself and share some background for context, and then we'll jump into the questions. Please feel free to put your questions, audience, in the chat, and we will incorporate those along the way. So Aaron, we'll kick it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. My name is Aaron Green. I'm the VP of Finance and Business Operations at Cagent Vascular. Cagent Vascular is a Series B peripheral vascular medical device startup. We've been around since late 2014, so it's coming up 6 years. We recently just launched our first commercial product on the market this January and have another one coming out at the end of this year. So I'm here to kind of talk about the full life cycle of kind of ideation of concept of a medical device all the way through now FDA clearance, reimbursement, and commercialization.
Great, thank you. David.
Good morning. I'm David Wierz. I'm a senior principal with the OCI Group. We focus on defining strategy, value, and payment for new technologies in healthcare, specifically in life sciences with biopharma and medtech, but also with an expanding focus in integration and adoption of digital technologies, both as standalone and as integrated elements within a broader portfolio of life sciences. Most recently have worked with ECRI and Plymouth Meeting, leading their group in applied solutions, and specifically focusing on questions of process, workflow, and throughput, and how medtech and medical devices interact with the delivery of care in each of those elements. So very, very much looking forward to the conversations this morning.
Thank you so much. Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Walchak. I'm a principal consultant with the KFW Group in Philadelphia. And my background is I've worked primarily in marketing and sales for large companies such as GE Healthcare and Johnson & Johnson. And I've also worked for some small startups as Duane Medical. My role, my principal focus is on reimbursement policy, health economics modeling, and a practical approach to reimbursement for medical devices. I've worked on some products like the drug-eluting stent, and I've also worked on some pretty, such things as imaging and ultrasound. So look forward to the conversation today.
Wonderful. Jonathan.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Weinbach. I'm the CEO of the New York Proton Center. Proton therapy is an advanced form of radiation oncology, and our center in the city is a partnership of 3 of the largest hospital groups in New York, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Mount Sinai, and Montefiore. So on the provider side, and so maybe a little different angle than some of the other panelists. And again, looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks. And last but not least, Judd.
I sort of feel like I'm the person on the firing squad here. I'm Judd Hollander. I'm an ER doc that moved into more of a business strategy role at Jefferson over a period of years. I'm the SVP for Healthcare Delivery Innovation and an associate dean. Relevant to this panel, I co-chair the Enterprise Digital Health Governing Council, and I lead the telemedicine program. So I spend a lot of my time trying to see what's a cool toy and what's actually useful for our patients. So I am curious to learn how you guys view and gals view the business model and how we can work better together.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll just jump in and Judd, you mentioned kind of business model. We find a lot of times, we see a lot of med tech startups very enamored with their thing, right? Their prototype, their toy, their invention, and it's very easy to keep going back and doing another iteration, add a little bell here, a little whistle here. But when is the right time to start thinking about the business model related to innovation? Defining what is the value proposition? How is this going to get paid for? What reimbursement exists? I'll kind of open that up to the group. It'd be interesting to hear different perspectives.
Well, I'll start, and I would even say before the value proposition, it's a question of what's the need in all seriousness. What's the clinical need specifically, and how does that need then translate into a value proposition, and what economics are required to try and support that? And frankly, is it, I think to Judd's point, is it something that's a really interesting technology, or is it something that actually has value in deployment, that it's actually going to influence care in some meaningful way?
Yeah, we've, and I'll take that. I think David, you're 100% right. And we sort of have a very algorithmic approach to this that frankly could be first grade, and the first question we ask is, what problem are we solving? And if someone knocks on our door and we didn't know we had that problem, we don't actually have that problem, and we don't need to entertain that solution. And then the next question we ask is, do we already have something that can solve this problem? And so as we go through those first 2 steps, we often see a bright, shiny object that might actually be better, might actually not, but might not be where we need to put our energy. And As someone once said to me, which really resonated, I put together a program that was critically important, had an unbelievable ROI, was a $3 million investment for an $18 million ROI, and it got turned down because there's only so many $3 million investments you could make. And that wasn't the most important one. And often people in the startup world are looking at, my thing works, look, there's an ROI. Well, it still costs money and has to compete with all the other things that need those same dollars. So I think, that's part of how we look at it. It's not each thing in isolation, because if I'm going to buy product A, I'm not going to get B, C, and D, even if there's a great ROI. So what do I need most?
That's a great point.
And this is Mary. I think one of the things is when you start with something, you need to look at how is it going to, if it launched today, how would the payers look at it? You can have a great ROI, but if it's not a covered benefit, or if it's not something that's in the plan, or that, who's your audience? If you have a great product and Medicare pays for it, but the product's, licensed for people under 65, you have a very small market. So I think that's a key component, is to understand what the market can bear. And you can make a great product, like you said, for $1 million, but if the average payment is $100, no one's going to be able to buy it. So I think, that's a key thing to look, and can you redesign the product? Can you use cheaper materials or a different, approach before you go into full scale production?
When I think about
no, go ahead, John.
Yeah, when I think about value, I think the first lens we look through is economic. How's this going to pay for itself, and the ROI stuff. But I do think it expands beyond that, and a lot of people make the case, how is this going to benefit patient care and outcomes? How can this improve efficiency, either for my patients or my staff? Is it just going to make the entire experience better? And sometimes you try and quantify those things. I think that's an important lens. I mean, you got to get the economics right, but you got to think about the other benefits on it as well. And we try and do that as a provider. That is, when people approach us and say, hey, here's the next thing I really want to try, this is going to make everything so much better. You listen to that stuff, but the economics do need to make sense.
I think building on what all the panelists have said, I think in medical device, in my experience, there's very little technology that's truly revolutionary. It's mostly evolutionary. And so whenever you're launching something, it's in the context of whatever there is competition. And you have to not only differentiate your value proposition, but there's always a switching cost, because you're not coming up with something that has never been done before. And so, with all the economics of whether it's reimbursement or cost of changing if you're a provider, all those things have to be factored into the decision when you're kind of deciding on launching a product.
Yeah, I want to just add to Aaron's point, because the switching cost thing is huge, or the implementation costs are huge. And I can't tell you the number of companies that come to me that want to pilot or give me something for free. Free is not free. Free is a minimum of $100,000 to $300,000 in integration costs to make it work with the electronic medical record. So it is actually having the ability to put on my headset and not your headset, and see how much time and money do I need to outlay for a free product, and then what is really going to be my ROI. I would say that 98% of the calls I get from startups say Medicare pays $40 and 40 times whatever would cover your costs. Well, it cost me about $39.99 to build that $40 thing. So I'm making, seriously pennies on the dollar is my, my margin. So it's understanding what the true costs are to a health system that can make you have an intelligent conversation with us.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that as well, because the fact one of the lessons that I've learned in time, because I actually started off in the provider side, I actually started off in ambulatory service management, and that was something that we saw on a regular basis, was what the implementation costs are, what the operation costs are, and I think this is a lesson that we've carried forward into, and I've carried forward into the roles I've had with operating companies, is that it really is that notion of what are the implications around process, workflow, and throughput. I mean, what is this doing to the structure and delivery of care? What is it doing with regard to the cost of care in total? What are the implementation costs? What are the transition costs? Because I mean, to your point, Judd, I mean, it's not just adding something to the EMR. It's the fact that if I'm switching, that means I'm also de-adding or deactivating something, where I now have to do a dual configuration to get realignment with regard to the information that's being transitioned into my EMR. And is that really being done effectively, or am I creating downstream effects that are potentially negative, potentially compromising either operations or revenue, and to your point, really driving the costs up? And so if you don't really think through those steps and what the implications are, it's very challenging to have an informed conversation, at least in my experience, very challenging to have an informed conversation with someone on the provider side, because you're just not talking the same language. I mean, you may be using the same words, but you're just not talking the same language.
Aaron, how did you guys navigate that kind of for early in the development process, as you're preparing for your, regulatory submission and launch, and where from the startup perspective, I'm interested how you think about reimbursement strategy and commercialization strategy, and how do you interact with the providers to address all these things?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's always evolving, to be completely frank. How we're thinking about launching new products now is different than now that we're a commercial organization, is different than how we looked at it 4 or 5 years ago. I think in the early on stages of the company, we had to figure out, is there truly a need from physicians and patients? Like what's the fundamental problem? And in our case, the fundamental problem is the outcomes are terrible for the disease that the patients have, and the tools that the physicians have to use it are not ideal. And our founders were physicians in the field who basically, the invention was to kind of remediate some of the problems that they had. At the time when I got recruited over, I was at Medtronic, and the first thing I asked our CEO was, how you can get paid for this thing, and how are you going to compete? And so, first you got to figure out, like, is there existing coding and stuff like that? And kind of the idea that we thought of was, again, with the theme of everything's evolutionary, we make an angioplasty balloon. So there's existing reimbursement for angioplasty balloons, there's existing predicates. So you have a benchmark of what the competition's getting paid and whether, we would fit into that. So kind of at an early stage, we're like, let's just, we make the device, make it work, and we'll fit into existing reimbursement coding. As now that we're much more mature and older, and we're developing new products, the idea is, can we get incremental reimbursement? And one of the things you have to do from both a CMS but also FDA, if you want to get that incremental reimbursement, is start before you develop the product, because that impacts how you get regulatory approval as well as reimbursement. If you're just going to get what's on the table already and is likely to go down over time, then you can go try to get under an existing code. So our thinking has evolved on that, but again, it's a lot of, to be frank, a lot of luck and timing to some extent.
Mary, I'm curious from your perspective, from GE and from J&J, and kind of compared to, where you've got tremendous amount of resources to bring to bear, and the startups that you work with and those experiences. What are, do you have any advice on navigating that?
I'd say I agree with Aaron, that what's really key is, a lot of companies look at the code and see if they can fit within it. I think one of the things, the misnomer is that code doesn't guarantee payment. It just guarantees like they can identify you. And I think one of the things I've seen recently is the payers are getting more sophisticated. They may pay for a procedure, but then they're not paying for that particular product to do that procedures. As the information system allows them to identify the products, that's a key thing. The other thing that's really key, a lot of procedures are secondary. They're not the primary procedure. When you put a hip in, that's the primary procedure, but you do a lot of other procedures along with that. And if your product is an adjunct procedure, you might not get separate reimbursement because this bundling of the payment system is increasing. So I really think that it does impact so the coding is important, but also I think one thing that a lot of startups neglect to do is how do they get their price of their system into the hospital's database, into their cost system, because you can charge something, but if the hospital's not capturing that cost and reporting it to Medicare, the payment is never going to be reflected in the payment. So I think, you know, you really need to understand not just what your product could potentially get paid, but how is that cost being captured in the system and being reflected so people know they have to pay for it.
Great point. So Judd and John, I'm curious from your perspective, you know, we talked a little bit about economics and making sure that works, but you know, what are you looking for in terms of the role, you know, looking at the role of evidence and outcomes in the clinical adoption? How does that factor in to your decision-making process, and what do startups need to be thinking about early on in gathering that data?
Well, I think the more evidence that something works, the better. I mean, it's kind of a simple concept. Now, I've been fortunate enough to lead products going through the FDA. It's not cheap. You know, these are often, I mean, devices, Dermabond, for example, which is a tissue adhesive for J&J. I was the physician that went to the advisory panel for that. So I've taken some pretty big things. It costs millions of dollars to get things through the physician advisory panel. And it costs a ton of money to do a good clinical trial. What doesn't impress me at all is a case study from blah, blah, blah institution, or a white paper where they clearly just multiplied two numbers together to say they saved money. Those to me show you don't understand my issues. And it doesn't matter how good your product is, you're just trying to throw some numbers in front of me and treat me like an idiot. So you lose credibility in doing that. And so it does come back to what problem am I solving, right? If it's a clear-cut clinical problem and I could see a path forward and you have some data showing it works, I'm more likely to take it than a white paper saying some of this is great. And you know, I'm not crazy. If you come to me and say this institution is using it, I call this institution and I call somebody who should be using it. And 9 out of 10 times they've never heard of it and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And it's one primary care practice using it. So you need to be honest with me. And if you have virtually nothing besides a cool concept, then ask us to partner with you and develop it out so you could better sell it to other people. And we may be able to strike a deal that makes sense. But coming in with a bunch of stuff that's, quarter truths or 1% truths probably isn't the best way to sell it to us, because I think everybody's going to make some phone calls before they spend some money.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, we always use the expression, we want to be on the leading edge, not the bleeding edge. And if we're going to be on the bleeding edge, if you really want us to be there, you got to partner with us. We're going to look for something in return. As Judd pointed out, it's not just the EMR costs. I mean, the workflow changes of bringing something in are massive, and can create a lot of problems on the back end. The industry I'm in, proton therapy, is a relatively new industry that was based on the physics of how something would work, right? There's a core scientific principle that's driving it. And so, we trust the science. I mean, it's kind of at the core of what we do. So that's got to be there. And then you want evidence to support it. And really all of that stuff needs to take place almost before the economics, and the economics are critical too. So you can't skip around on any of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The phrase, when I think about medtech, the phrase "go big or go home" comes to mind, where it does cost a ton of money to do things right, but and by right meaning spending the money on properly designed clinical trial that's measuring the things that the providers want to see for adoption, and being forthcoming in that. Starting your design history file early. Nobody has enough money to change the way FDA is going to make their decision. And so engage with them early and often. take their guidance to heart, check in and validate those things, because that's really where things can go off the rails and cost even more money, right, than doing it properly from the beginning. So don't go into this industry trying to take shortcuts on the data and the proper pathways for doing things. And I think you've heard it here. And so there was a question in the chat that popped up that caught my attention here related to this conversation. So how do you get in front of the decision makers of the hospitals? So it's one thing to, understand and talk about the benefits and things like that, but it's really hard to sell and get in front of the decision makers. Who do startups need to be thinking about pitching to? Judd, is it your department on the innovation side? Is it the C-suite? Is it the value analysis committee? Is it the head of supply chain? What does that process look like?
So we've structured that. And one of the things we did, our Enterprise Digital Health Governing Council was designed so you actually couldn't come in through one of 37 back doors. And if you came in and spoke to David, we knew already. And if David wasn't interested, we knew, so you're going to Jonathan and coming back, we know somebody's not interested and we could look at why. So once you come to us, we sort of catalog things. But I come back to my first point, which is what problem are we trying to solve? You need to come in through the person whose problem you're solving is there. Don't come to me with a heart failure idea. Get the heart failure people to love it enough that they're willing to commit their time and energy to pushing it through. Because if they don't love it enough, they're not going to use it. And every health system has done deals and worked on a product without involving the clinicians to the appropriate degree, and then nobody uses it. So there are some things that, honestly, I don't see as that valuable, but our specialists do. And they're willing to, stamp their feet and scream and yell. And we don't have anything else that does it. So they're the experts. So let's move forward and see if we could strike a reasonable deal to take this thing that's proof of concept into the real world. And we'll do that. So come in with the end user through their hierarchy. And for us, we're service line oriented. So you got to get the cardiology to want it, but I don't want to talk to every cardiologist about everything. It has to run up through their senior VP administrator and their senior VP, clinician. And if they both sign off on it and they're willing to do the work and they get a cost from our IT department on what integration would be. And by the time they come to me, there's a quasi business plan. It's not a real business plan, but they've done some work and jumped over some hurdles and in essence proven this is really important to them. And that's the way to come in, I think.
I get 15 solicitation emails a day. I mean, I don't even, if there's no context to them, they don't mean anything. You need a champion to do it. And I think, Judd, your point is a really good one, right? So once somebody's a champion on it, they need to get IT involved. They need to get facilities involved. They need to get all, every other department that this is going to touch needs to sign off on this before you even do a real analysis on this. So it's not just one champion. It starts with one champion, but they need to get buy-in from other people as well. And again, it's got to run up to a real decision maker in a department. You can't have, 20 different physicians each bringing you a different idea. You need to go through channels on this stuff. Otherwise, there's too much out there. It gets too chaotic.
I think building on both Judd and Jonathan's points, in our experience, you got to go with the primary user who's fixing it. And what the biggest mistake you can make is if you go to management, not the end user, but management. Generally, they're not going to know enough about your particular technology to know, the right questions to ask. You can't be an expert at everything. And what you end up having, going back to the earlier question about what you should invest in clinical studies and stuff like that, is you get these comments about, we want you to do a giant clinical study, you don't have enough data, whatever it is, and they don't have the context. They're comparing you to a drug, your medical device, a PMA versus 510K. And if you go directly to the user, who's ultimately going to run it up their own internal flagpole, they're much more willing, able, and thoughtful in telling you, yeah, you do need more data, or no, this is a tool I'm using, and based on my very, specific experience in my very specific institution, it solves a very specific problem for me, and I like it enough that I'm going to run up my own flagpole to get it into your system. And so I think by going that way, not only do you get it approved faster, but you also inform your clinical strategy and what is a good financial investment versus a waste of money.
There's a couple things that I'd like to add. I mean, one in the work that we've been doing, that I've been doing the last 18 months, it's been interesting, the implications of COVID with regard to at least what I've seen, and curious what Judd and Jonathan think about this, but what I've seen in terms of decision making within institutions. And it really has focused, I think, more, as Judd said, on the service lines and what's happening in the standpoint of the economics of care delivery and the value of care delivery within the context of service lines. And so from the standpoint of market entry, that to me, at least from what I've experienced, becomes the point. One thing I want to add is something else I want to add, just to, again, I'm interested in getting thoughts on this from Aaron and Mary. The whole notion of clinical trial design. I mean, we talk a lot about clinical trial design, and you're right, Aaron, in terms of, what you need to look at. One of the things, again, that been involved in with a couple of different companies is this notion of parallel trials, and the fact of how do you think about your economic story, and how do you think about designing endpoints in for your economic story. But again, coming back to something Judd said early on, how do you think about what the cost implications are for adopting the technology into care? And is that actually a third arm of a trial? That you obviously have to think about the clinical endpoints. You clearly need to think about the economic endpoints, but also you need to think about what those cost endpoints are. And do you need to think about really three sets of answers that you want to have as you think about structuring a trial?
And this is Mary, David. I'll just continue on that thought. I would say yes. I think that the one thing is, what is the price of your product? Because that third arm will help power what the price of the product is. Because
Right.
You can have a great product, it could be worth $1 million, but if it costs $2 million to implement, as Jonathan and Judd have said, that how can you partner with them to do that? And you really need to understand how much money you're putting at risk to do that partnership. Yes, it may be successful, but can you afford to partner with them and pay for that implementation? I think going back a step further, I think what's really important, people, especially in devices, what I see is they want to hurry up and get that FDA approved. So they pick some simple indication that's broad range of 510K, and they get their product through. And then the moment it's through, it's no longer an orange. Now it's a unique hybrid, fruit that no one's ever seen before. And they try to, then go in and try to code jam or pick a code that they like because they don't like the payment that they're going. And it goes back to their, IFU. I think if companies would look and, say, okay, I'm going to do this FDA, ultrasound gets paid this. If I'm an ultrasound, I'm an ultrasound. If I'm saying I'm a different type of ultrasound technology, then it has to be clearly spelled out so they could get the coding and everything in place. But, and that goes back to the implementation cost, because the hospitals are going to put it in the same bucket. Like, what department is going to buy this product? If the radiology department is buying it, but all the revenue goes to someone else, then you have an internal issue too. But I think
Mary's absolutely right. And, most med tech companies are if you get to a commercial stage, you're probably venture backed, because, to get to a commercial stage, you're talking tens of millions of dollars. And let's say, you do your first in human study, you get a little bit of data. Everyone wants more data, right? As they should. And then the question is, okay, what's your next study? And the next study is, I don't know, $1 million, $2 million. And, you design the endpoints. Yep, we'll hit those endpoints because, we got the best device ever. We're going to do it in this amount of time. But then the immediate question is, okay, with $2 million, do I hire 5 more sales reps who can go run around? Do I, get my cost of goods down from a manufacturing perspective, because I need that to get my margin up so that I can actually price it appropriately for the hospital as well as a potential acquisition? So, these are the trade-offs that, $1 million can go a lot of different ways, and everyone wants data, but data, even if I can prove the endpoint that I want to prove, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to hit my sales number or my margin number, which ultimately it's a business, and that's the name of the game. So you have to weigh those trade-offs all the time.
Just from a provider perspective, we're totally indifferent to your costs. We have no empathy for you. We just want it to make economic sense for us.
Right. So the last two comments I think are really important, and there's a couple things that I'm just going to say that it's different values to different groups of people, right? If you're going in the value-based care and you believe the world is getting there faster than it is in Philadelphia, well, then we want to spend less on every additional product and not more to save money. And so it's right-sizing the model. So when we're predominantly in a fee-for-service world, we're not going to go bankrupt, because every health system, except for one around here, lost a bundle last year during COVID days. And then we wanted to work in a value-based system. The other thing I find when I get pitch decks is you're talking to me about heart failure. You don't need to have 10 slides that says heart failure is expensive. By the time you get through that and tell me about your product, I'm lost. You're not selling, when you come to me, to a VC firm that may not understand what heart failure is. So just come in and say, we deal with heart failure. Boom. What do you do? What are your outcomes? And then the other thing that's going to be news to all of you and drive you crazy, because it's like what your ego's about. I don't care for serial entrepreneurs. To me, that's a negative, because although Jefferson does periodically invest in companies and, we may want the exit strategy, telling me you spent 3 years on a product and cashed out for $1 billion doesn't make me confident that the product is good. It makes me confident that you've developed something that's going to make you short-term money. And then God knows what's going to happen to the product you sold to me when someone buys it out. So I am much more interested in someone that has a long-term track record and develops something from nothing into something good and stays with it than someone flipping companies and has a beautiful yacht. Although I'll be happy to go out on your yacht. Like, I'm not crazy.
That's really, really valuable perspective. And there's a question that came up in the chat really tied to that and partnering with companies. And so let's see here. What resources does a startup need to offer in order to approach a partner, in doing a co-development or partnership to develop the evidence?
The brief answer is something that makes it worthwhile. So, am I going to see an ROI? Is it worth my investment of time? And if I have $1 million this year to invest, is this something worth taking out some fraction of that $1 million, whether it be true investment or just time and money of people who are already on my payroll?
Time is unbelievably valuable for everybody, right? So if you can make a case that it's going to save me time and has some economic benefit, and those lenses, especially when somebody comes to you with something new. So you got to hit on the head what a core problem you're trying to solve is. It can't be kind of on the side, maybe it'll be helpful. It's not worth the effort to try and fit it into the issue I have. So you really got to nail solving a core issue, and be able to do it efficiently. I can't develop your product for you. You've got to do the back end on it. I'm happy to tell you what's wrong with it, but you've got to commit the resources to fixing it.
So one question that I ask folks when I'm working with them in early stage companies is what is your business model? And I'll be quite, kind of blunt. Does the world really need another medical device company commercializing a product? And I think that's an appropriate question to ask. What is your business model? What is your end state? What are you looking to accomplish here? And to what extent do you need to become a full-on commercial entity to be successful? I think to Judd's point, is it sufficient to say that you can demonstrate value in meeting a need and be able to out-license to a company that has a portfolio of products that supports an integrated solution for a Jefferson or for Jonathan? So that's I think something to consider. The other thing I want to come back to is this notion of coding. And it builds on Judd's comment rather about value-based care. Because one of the things I think you need to think about is just that. I mean, to what extent it's not just the question, does coding get you payment? And the answer is no. It's to what extent do you fit within, again, care delivery? How do you fit? And to some degree, the question you almost need to ask yourself is, does coding even matter? Because again, it's going to come down to the fact of, can you do something that's going to meet that clinical need in a way that costs less? And that's both in a fee-for-service environment and a value-based care environment. And if you can't do that, don't bother.
Great point. So I keep hearing volume versus value. So I'll ask the question, where are we? I honestly, I followed this a lot before COVID, and COVID just kind of upended everything. Where are we in the national shift from volume to value?
We're moving slowly. I mean, it's you're exactly right. COVID kind of gave everybody a pause for things, at least in the oncology space. It's starting to get some momentum again, and it has major impacts. And it's gonna, it's gonna disrupt the industry in a lot of different ways. But I think as you think about bringing devices into this, it's still the same ROI calculation. It's just the calculation gets harder now. There's going to be less money out there. And so it puts additional pressure on making the economics of this work, because, if you're going to get hit with bundled payments and things like that, you've really got to understand, if you're introducing something new into there, how it's going to impact your costs and your bottom line on it.
And this is Mary. I also think in this episode of care, the shifting of where procedures are done. I mean, the biggest impact, which we haven't even started to see, is that now there's no inpatient only procedures for Medicare. They can all be done in the outpatient. So all these hips and knees that really maybe had a little bit of cushion in them in the hospitals are now being done in the outpatient. So it's less cost to the hospital, but it's also less revenue. So how is that going to impact their ability to purchase new equipment? Or how are the hospital's fundamental revenue generation models going to be changing now that we're going to have more patient procedures done in the outpatient setting?
Are you seeing any trends related to this? How do I pick where I'm going to launch my product? Am I going to sell into a large academic research hospital? Am I targeting rural America? Is it a large community hospital, in a rural area? To Mary's point, where procedures are going to be done, there seems to be a notion of, if I can hit the ball out of the park at, Mount Sinai, right? Or Brigham Women's or some big KOL name system, then I'm golden across the board, across the country. And I'm pretty sure it doesn't work that way. Aaron, I see you nodding your head. What advice do you have in kind of picking your spots?
Well, again, I think it evolves where you are in your life stage as a company. At the beginning, you got to follow the money. You need to get it out there. And if Mount Sinai, the bigger the institution, the bigger the academics, the more red tape there is. So I'm equally happy going to a local community center that has no big name but pays a great price because they want to have something new and different, and they got a KOL who can bring it in and get it through their VAC committee fast, than Mount Sinai. Now, over time, to Mary's point, and especially in our business, everything is moving to the outpatient, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's killing the hospitals. And, you talk to physicians, and, there's a lot of politics in terms of how many case days they do in the hospital because they're stealing the revenue and everyone's playing nice. But, as you get more mature as a company, you can get your cost of goods down, your bill of materials down. And then you can offer something hopefully to the outpatient setting where you as the startup keep your margin, but the end buyer gets it at a much, much lower price. But that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And so kind of the advice to startups I would give is, just follow the money trail. Get as much as you can, keep your price as high as you can for as long as you can, but make sure in the background you're building your plan B so that you can get it down and scale it, because it will become a commodity over time. And at the end of the day, to everyone's point, that's what you want, right? You want to create value and you want to offer a good product at as low a cost as possible to payers and providers and have a great outcome for patients. But you also, as a company, need to make money and keep your margin, and your investors need to make their money back, because they're taking a 10-year risk on you to get it to this point. So I think it's an evolving process, but starting off, go where you can get paid the most.
Great insight. We've got some great questions coming in. So question, what are some common red flags that you see when evaluating an early stage company?
So it's I'll go briefly on this. And Aaron, to your point, it's great to follow the money. When I'm going to call your customers, and it matters who they are. I want to see a name there. So you need, and that probably takes place in the development stage of things. You got to partner with somebody who I'm going to trust. So what's a red flag? A red flag for me is I don't know anybody who's using it. And if I call that customer, I can read between the lines and hear some concerns there. That'll kill a deal for me instantly. It's just not too much on the line. It's not worth the risk.
Other red flags?
Know your competition. I mean, something that again, I've seen on the buyer side when I've actually been working on the inside, is people will come in without an understanding of what else is out there that addresses what you see as a unique solution to a need. And if you cannot put your product in context and understand what, I think back to Judd's point, what are we doing today and what are you doing that's different? If you don't understand that competitive set and performance and practice of your competitors, again, it's a credibility issue. You've really lost credibility.
I'm going to add to this overselling interoperability, which is the biggest fatal flaw. I know one thing for a fact: if you're a startup, you cannot see inside of Epic. So to walk in and tell me you can integrate with Epic, you've already got a fatal flaw. You're done. And my idea of integration isn't putting a PDF on tab number 47 so that if I knew where to look, I might be able to find it 400 clicks later. Yeah. So just be honest. You can't do that. That's one of the things you need from Jonathan, or you need from me if you want to partner with us. We need to help you get into the App Store and and be able to integrate with Epic or Cerner or whoever in a meaningful way. Just don't oversell your capabilities.
I think on the investor side, kind of a fatal flaw is we see lots of great ideas with I'll call them inventors. That's very different than having great management. And to get from early stage to something that's commercial, management wins every time. Because again, everything's that you can find people that can adapt things. And so I think kind of really, venture capitalists always say about the team. I think when they say that, what they really mean is it's about the team who can kind of balance all the competing needs and still kind of move the ball forward. So if all you have is a great idea with a great founder, but there's no management around it, I'd stay away from that.
Another question, how important is it to have an implementation partner with special expertise in the product workflow integration with your EHR? Is that a partnership worth exploring for product tech companies before approaching a large organization? Very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if it's EHR integration, by the way, I'm not going to believe you, whatever you tell me anyway. It's going to be much harder than you think it's going to be. It's going to be much harder than anybody tells me it's going to be. It's going to be a pain. So yeah, if you can solve that for me, I still won't believe you, but it'd be great if you could solve it.
Great. What, as we kind of come to the end here, wanted to hear, we talked about volume to value coming out of COVID. What trends are you seeing? Well, twofold here. Judd, you mentioned telemedicine earlier. I'm interested in your perspective on COVID gave telemedicine kind of a hall pass, right? And forced the issue of how we integrate these new technologies related to digital health, telemedicine, remote monitoring, gave it kind of a platform for use cases. Do you see that trend continuing? Is telemedicine here to stay? And what do we need to be thinking about in terms of who the customer might be and how these new technologies are paid for?
So it's interesting. The customer isn't always who you think it is, which is alluded to, right, Tiff, in your question. And so our net promoter scores in our on-demand telemedicine platform run in the 70 to 90 every month. And when we survey people 10 days after they did the visit, about 80% have already recommended the platform to their friends or family. You can't get better data than that. But yet we don't have a phenomenal amount of growth outside of COVID. And yet it came down after COVID. We have data in our scheduled visit platform pre-COVID that 75% of scheduled visits were driven by the provider. Now, it turns out we have that great data from the patients because they don't care if you click on and off for a minute or they don't see your picture. They only care if they get convenient care. But the provider, if that patient blips out for a millisecond, oh my God, it's the end of the world. I hate this. I don't want to use it. And so one of the things we've learned in our scheduled visit platform is to be, and I take this quote from Joe DeVivo of Teladoc, is to be maniacal about the technology. Because any little problem on the provider side makes them not want to do calls again. And so the customer we're selling telemedicine to, you might think is the patient. The customer we want to get to use it is actually the provider because they drive the patient, but none of that works if the payer doesn't pay for it. And so telemedicine has come back down because the payers have done to me what is the worst thing in the world. They've created uncertainty by kicking the can down the road for 2 months at a time. I can't give up my leases for 2 months of telemedicine, right? My leases aren't monthly, they're not yearly, they're 5 to 10 years on the short term, maybe 99 years on the long term. So I need to have some certainty as to whether this is going to be paid for to convert the market over. And so I think really it's getting the payers on board, but then the next thing is the provider, even though clearly the most important person in this is the patient, but the patients are the easiest to make happen.
It's funny, one of the things that I hear is the docs want to be distant, but they want the patients on site. They want a nurse there with them. They want somebody to manipulate them. But the docs are happy to take a call from from anywhere else. And in terms of how this is going to get implemented, this is one that you need a government leader or somebody to just say, look, this is what we're going to do. Otherwise, it's stop and start, and it's going to be chaotic. And I think we've got a couple of years of chaos before somebody's going to say, all right, let's just do this.
Well, let's talk about that. My kind of last question, and you teed it up for me, John. So thank you for that. With the new Biden administration, and he's got his hands full right now with COVID and infrastructure bills and that sort of stuff. But what trends do you see on the horizon with the new administration as it relates to these issues?
I think we're still kind of in a wait and see approach. I think, again, I'm in the cancer world. And so Biden's been a huge proponent of cancer care and has his moonshot initiatives. So everybody's really hopeful that there's going to be some seismic changes, but none of that stuff has been implemented yet. And it all happens so much slower than everybody thinks it's going to happen. I mean, I think change in healthcare, you're moving a massive ship. And so, you know, I think we're still kind of waiting to see if there's going to be anything meaningful that happens.
I mean, I've had a chance to interact with some of the folks down in Baltimore at CMS on a couple different issues, and I think what you're facing is you know, interest versus ability, and you know, there's interest in doing a lot of different things. There's interest in establishing, I think, you know, as Judd said, the framework for permanency with regard to the use of, broadly speaking, the use of digital technologies in healthcare, telemedicine, remote care management, et cetera. I mean, there's a number of different folks, I think, in CMS who are interested in doing that. The questions really become twofold. Number one, short term, you know, what's going on with COVID and the continuation of the public health emergency. But longer term, look, you've got a Senate that's 50-50, and that's a profoundly limiting factor, not just from a legislative standpoint, but also from a regulatory standpoint, because the question becomes, you know, if CMS moves too far in one direction, you know, will Congress view that as benign, or will Congress view that as a cause célèbre?
And this is Mary. I think for startup companies, you know, we've talked, you know, they really need to look at health policy and CMS. I mean, you know, they publish rules every year. You know, they do a plan to Congress, right? People have to understand, even if they're small, a lot of the professional, like AdvaMed or the MedTech Society, they all have government policies. They need to start following what's going on with their technology and how that's going to be paid for or covered or not covered, or are we taking money away from this? So they're not caught short-sighted. Like, they could look today and say, okay, my technology fits under a DRG or payment, and I'm good. And they bury their head and they go and make a great technology. And 3 years later, they wake up and guess what? That payment's gone. And, you know, because the payment is fleeting, and with all these other pressing needs, CMS is balanced budget neutral, it will shift money around. And I think that's what companies need to, I'm not saying you got to do it every day, but they need to do that on a regular checkup, at least annually.
And the other thing I'll add is some of the measures that CMS has put in place with the new technology initiatives, whether it's the add-on payments or other vehicles, are not a panacea for a startup company. They are not. Because again, one of the things that I found being on the inside and also on the buyer side is that, look, again, it gets back to this issue of startup costs. Yeah, I can get a new technology add-on payment for 2 years. But number one, I think, as we've talked about, does the cost of switching and implementation justify the additional revenue which may or may not be available under that add-on payment? And number two, at the end of 2 years, it goes away. And so, I mean, a lot of companies view these, particularly early stage companies, view these what I call one-offs as kind of a panacea. It's not. It's just not.
Well, we're right at time. And so I think this has been a great discussion. I've certainly learned a lot from you guys. And I think, you know, overall, we kicked off the panel with talking about how MedTech's a lot. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of information to sort through. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of stakeholders. And again, it's not rocket science, but it is complicated, and you got to follow the process. And I think, you know, ultimately what has inspired me throughout my career in MedTech and even now the broader lens from the Science Center is the work that we do every day, whether we're in reimbursement or a provider or an engineer or a marketing person or a finance person or what have you. We get to wake up every day and work towards making the lives of patients better. And that's what I just love, the underlying theme, that common thread across all these technology companies. So thanks to the panel. And thanks again to Dean and Heidi for inviting me to have this conversation.
Tiff, thank you. And to all the panelists, Mary, Jonathan, David, Aaron, just thank you for all your insightful comments. Just really, really good stuff. And we're incredibly proud to help support the MedTech community here and around Philadelphia. And again, want to thank all of our sponsors, Baker Tilly, Drexel, Duane Morris, EisnerAmper, and Fox Rothschild. And again, to Tiff, you and the Science Center for all of your leadership in the space as well, that I know is only going to get better with your arrival here in Philadelphia. With that, you can find in chat a link to the Remo room. And if you haven't had the opportunity to do this yet, it's a wonderful experience. We'll give people a minute here as we're closing just to link over. But all you need to do is click on the link in chat. It'll bring you to the Remo room where you can have live conversations at tables with your peers, with fellow panelists, etc. So with that, again, thank you once again to all participants, speakers. Wish everyone a terrific day and rest of the week. And hopefully we'll see you in the Remo room. Thank you.
Thank you.